radicalization of youth that we've seen in Europe is an interesting phenomenon, and in general, the media has presented it as a kind of isolated phenomenon. But in fact, we've seen it before. In Europe in particular, there were movements in the 1970s that were generally communist, like the Baader-Meinhof gang in Germany, Action Directe in France, and the Red Brigades in Italy. And these groups were generally highly educated individuals who often they were studying science or sociology, and they embraced a very radical left message, and they really thought they were purifying society with their attacks in an attempt to bring about a communist government. So they were strongly idealized. They strongly idealized what they read. They were very well versed in the literature as well, Marx, Lenin, and so on. The phenomenon we're seeing today of the young Islamic-inspired terrorists, especially those that are claiming to be attacking targets on behalf of ISIS or Islamic State, is much more complex and in some ways much more crude. It's not, I think the classic case that really started to have me question the general idea that they were being radicalized by their imams at the mosque, and then they wanted to put that into practice, was a story of one of the ISIS fighters, a young guy from England, who was caught in Turkey, and in his backpack he had a book called Islam for Dummies. So that doesn't sound to me like someone who knows what the ideology is about, or has any clue as to how to interpret the Quran, and then come up with attacks. So that was my first clue. Then I'd heard similar cases repeatedly from, not just from England, from other countries. But England is one of the big suppliers. The other main suppliers are France and Belgium of these young radicals. In France, we had the attack on November 13th at Bataclan Club in Paris. They've managed to catch some of those responsible in Belgium later on. When I saw the profile and heard the interviews of the character, particularly when I saw him trying to evade or trying to resist the arrest, instead of relishing it as a martyr, that was another clue. And then the statement from his lawyer, this is a quote, he has the intelligence of an empty ashtray. Certainly does not tell me, again, it proved to me that the radicalization here is quite different. In fact, one might say, to quote a French scholar who's been looking at this problem, this radicalization really, these radicals begin in petty crime. Particularly the Bataclan attackers, to me, I agree with this analysis, have much more to do with petty crime, stealing cars and selling drugs on the streets of Brussels or Paris, than they do with learning the Quran by heart in the mosque. In other words, the ISIS is trying to recruit perhaps petty criminals, and not just petty ones, ones that have the ability to commit more violent crimes. For example, Abdus Salam, the one who has the intelligence of the ashtray, shot a policeman in Belgium. He was in jail and then spent a reduced sentence and then was back on the streets. So living in that isolated environment that is the Molenbeek area of Brussels. So we have to look, I think we've been looking at it as an ideological problem, bringing Islamologists and people to analyze it, and terrorism experts. But I think this begins really with basic policing as a way to confront the risk, because this is where they're starting. Some of them might get to Syria now, or even to some mosques, and may get some kind of an education in the Islamic and and it's I have to stress it's a particular interpretation of Islam. It's not all Islam, of course, but they may get some kind of radicalization. But it's not the start. It's the second part. They begin as petty criminals and then become radicals. Now it is very important for us to determine which is which, because that will help governments organize the response. The alternative view is that they become radicalized first, and then they exercise their ideology in the same way that those young people of the 1970s I mentioned earlier did. Those were, I believe, if that were the problem, it would be easier to stop, because then we could target the mosques, we could target the preachers, we could target the so-called intellectuals of the movement, and stop the process from the top. But this is more, the actual phenomenon is more dangerous, because it has much more delinked roots. There are no anybody can become a radical. You don't need the special education. Anyone can claim allegiance to this group, and the ties are looser and more volatile. There has been a similar phenomenon in North America as well. I believe in Canada the cases of people joining ISIS was, I think there were 80 Canadian fighters or so were caught in Syria, and about 200 Americans. I think in Canada and the US it's a bit different. In Europe there is definitely a dominance of French and Belgian with England. These are where many Muslims live in special areas of the city that they have their ghettos of some kind. In Canada and the United States, we don't have that so much. You might say actually in Canada, in particular, Muslims are much better integrated. We have a huge Muslim population, and again, very few have actually joined. But I want to bring the example of two cases that really struck me, and this was before Islamic State or ISIS became a household name. In fact, these two joined not ISIS, but the one we like to talk a lot about in 2013, 2012, which is Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, the Al-Qaeda branch of North Africa that led a number of attacks, including the one against recently in Burkina Faso against tourists and Ivory Coast. They're still quite strong. One was, both I believe were from London, Ontario. One was from the name of Greek descent, and the other one was of Korean descent. And both somehow decided to go to Mauritania, where they claimed to have been studying Arabic, and then they ended up being in the group that blew up British petroleum gas plant in Algeria, in Al-Menas. That was quite a big attack. 50 people or so were killed. A huge facility was attacked, and these two speak to the other phenomenon. I think there's a kind of adventurism involved. that we can't discount. It's almost like the Foreign Legion of war. Young people looking for adventure and I'm not sure to what extent they were radicalized because they went to Mauritania to learn Arabic so that they could read the Quran in Arabic. Now I don't know what kind of Arabic you learn in Mauritania. It's not really wouldn't be my first choice. I would go to Cairo or to learn Arabic or Beirut, not Nouakchott in Mauritania, where you get an accent that's very mixed and with Southern African languages. So they obviously had some. This group must have had some links to perhaps a mosque, not sure what, to attract them, to get them to that place, because it's not the first place that comes to mind. So there were definitely there was a mechanism that allowed them to go there. So we see, and this is one of the differences between Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I think with Al-Qaeda, we have seen a tendency to prepare the youth already in the countries where they live and to recruit them more directly and perhaps to start the radicalization process. But with ISIS, it has been more of a free-for-all. And what I think one of the differences is with ISIS, there's more opportunism because ISIS has a state, and that state produces oil, which they smuggle on the black market. In other words, they have money, so they actually pay. Many people who have gone to ISIS from Tunisia. Tunisia is the first country of the so-called Arab Spring, has a huge unemployment problem. It doesn't have oil like many other Arab countries. And it turns out that many of the ISIS fighters that have been caught from Tunisia were really doing it as a job. They went to fight for money. They made much more money than they could ever hope to make at home. Al-Qaeda, we don't have that phenomenon. At least I have not heard of Al-Qaeda fighters or Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb being motivated by money, at least not at first. They might raid and loot, as we saw in Mali in 2012, 2013, and actually they're still there. But I think there's a different mechanism between Al-Qaeda and more a tendency to idealize first with Al-Qaeda. And with ISIS, I also think from North America, the trip is so long, it does begin with some kind of, I'm not sure if idealization is the right word or inspiration, and you may get people who are a little bit, they're not operating on all cylinders, as they say, who might get, I don't know, they exalted. I'm not sure what the term to use here, but they start to feel like they can join something bigger than themselves and do something in the name of something, but that they don't clearly understand. Another point to consider in both ISIS or Al-Qaeda, and really, to me, the strangest of them all, is the radicalization of women. In Al-Qaeda, this wasn't common at all. Certainly not until very late. But in ISIS, with the people claiming allegiance to ISIS, there have been actual women fighters on the ground. So I don't know where this starts is perhaps the biggest mystery of the entire Islamic State. Luckily, it's not a very big phenomenon. It's still, we can count them on fingers. But I believe in this case, the radicalization is perhaps due to some form of revenge. In some cases, we have wives or girlfriends or sisters of people who, of men who have been killed on the battlefield, whether this battlefield is in Europe or whether it's an actual battlefield, in some kind of attack. And they join ISIS to avenge their male relative. Now, this is definitely the case. This has been the case, for example, in Chechnya, with Chechen women have done this for some time. You may remember in Moscow at a theater, several people were held hostage in 2004, I think it was. And the main attackers, certainly the most active and dangerous person in that whole operation was a woman who had lost, it turns out, her husband in battle. And that's, I believe, if you're looking for a logical explanation, that's where it begins. To me, in general, the women there's a very personal story behind their so-called radicalization, and then which takes over. But in North America, this is very isolated. The women caught in battle tend to be more local, I believe. They're more either Syrian or in Syria or Iraqi, or in Chechnya, by the way. The similarities between how ISIS fights in Syria and Chechnya against the Russians is very similar. In fact, there are many Chechens involved in ISIS.